Nigeria wasn't born. It was signed into existence by two people. Not a vote, not a combined voice, just a decision that forced millions of lives to live in it forever. On the first day of January, 1914, two people sat across from each other at a ceremony in Lugard Hall,
Lokoja,
a town chosen specifically because it sat at the point where the Niger and the Benue rivers meet. One man was Frederick Lugard, a British administrator. The other was his wife, Flora Shaw, the journalist, who had literally named this place Nigeria in a newspaper column 16 years earlier. There was no vote, no referendum, no gathering of kings, emirs, or elected representatives from the hundreds of nations about to be merged. No Igbo elder was consulted. No Yoruba Orba was asked. No Kanuri nobleman, no Tiv farmer, no Ijor fisherman, no Efik trader, none of them were in that room. In that room, two British citizens signed paperwork that joined the Northern and Southern Protectorates into a single colonial territory of roughly 15 million people. They called it the Amalgamation. It took less than an afternoon. What it created, the contradictions, the fractures, the wars, the oil, the federalism, the identity is still being negotiated today. This is the story of how Nigeria was invented. What you just watched was not ancient history. The people in that room in Lokoja, Lord Lugard, Flora Shaw, the British officials who orchestrated this, they were making a decision about the lives of more human beings than lived in Britain itself at the time. And they made it for reasons that had almost nothing to do with those human beings. By the end of this video, you are going to understand what those reasons actually were, and they are not the reasons you were taught in school. You are going to find out that Nigeria as a unified territory was not a British plan for empire building. It was a cost-cutting measure, a budget decision, and the man who proposed it put it in writing so plainly that it reads less like imperial statecraft and more like a memo from a colonial accounting department. You are going to learn what the North and South actually looked like before the British arrived, two entirely different worlds, developing along entirely different lines, and understand what was actually destroyed when they were merged without consent. You are going to hear the voices of the people who opposed the amalgamation at the time. Not in hindsight, at the time. And you are going to find out what happened to those voices. And you are going to sit with the revelation that has haunted every serious Nigerian historian who has ever touched this period. The single fact, the year 1914, that reframes every argument Nigerians have been having about their country for the last 60 years. This is not the version that was put in the textbooks, any textbook. To understand what was destroyed in 1914, you first have to understand what existed before 1914. And here is the first thing you need to know. The land that became Nigeria was not a blank space waiting to be named. It was one of the most densely populated, politically complex, and culturally diverse regions on Earth. Let's set the scene. By the early 1800s, the territory that the British would eventually call Nigeria was home to hundreds of distinct political entities, each with its own language, governance structure, economy, military, and understanding of the world. These were not tribes in the dismissive colonial sense of that word. These were nations. Many of them had been governing themselves with sophisticated administrative systems for centuries before a single British ship appeared on the Nigerian coast. In the north, the Sokoto Caliphate, founded in 1804 by Usman Dan Fodio, had become one of the largest political entities in Africa. By the mid-1800s, it controlled territory larger than Western Europe, governed millions of people across a network of emirates, maintained a functioning legal system based on Islamic jurisprudence, and ran long-distance trade routes that stretched from the Sahara to the forest belt. The Caliphate was not a loose confederation of villages. It was a state, a real one. In the southwest, the Yoruba world, though fractured by the Oyo Empire's collapse earlier in the century and the internal wars that followed, still represented an extraordinarily sophisticated urban civilization.
Ibadan,
by the 1850s, was one of the largest cities in sub-Saharan Africa.
Abeokuta
Had just successfully repelled a Dahomean military assault with a combination of traditional defense and newly acquired firearms. These were not passive communities waiting for outside order. They were fighting, trading, negotiating, and governing themselves with energy and intelligence. In the southeast, Igbo communities operated through one of the most fascinating political systems in the world, a largely decentralized republican model in which authority was distributed across age, grades, title societies, and community assemblies rather than concentrated in a single monarch. The British spent decades trying to understand this system. They mostly failed. What they eventually decided was that if they couldn't find a single chief to sign a treaty with, they would simply create one, a decision with consequences that echoed through the colonial period and beyond. Along the coast, in the Niger Delta, the Ijaw, Efik, Ibibio, and Kalabari peoples had been running sophisticated long-distance trading operations with European merchants since the 1500s. The city-states of the Delta Calabar, Bani, Brass, Warri, were not peripheral outposts. They were commercial hubs, operating their own currencies, their own credit systems, their own rules of commercial engagement. Had just when the British arrived, they arrived as trade partners first. For a long time, the Africans held significant leverage in those relationships. Here is the fact that tends to stop people cold. Lagos, before the British annexed it in 1861, was not a struggling fishing village. It was a commercially active, politically contested port city with a population in the tens of thousands, running trade in cloth, enslaved people, palm oil, and manufactured goods. The British did not arrive to build something. They arrived because something was already there, and they wanted control of it. So, when you hear the word amalgamation, understand what is actually being described. The merging, by external administrative decision, of hundreds of distinct political entities, some of them ancient, some of them powerful, all of them self-governing into a single colonial administrative unit. Not because those entities had anything to do with each other, not because their people had asked to be joined, but because of a set of decisions made in London offices that we are going to get to very shortly. Before we do, here is the detail that tends to reframe everything that follows. Frederick Lugard, the man who carried out the amalgamation, had never planned to stay in Nigeria permanently. He came, as most colonial administrators did, on a temporary posting. What he found when he arrived was two separate British-administered territories that were financially and administratively a mess. And his solution, the one he proposed to London and London approved, was not primarily a political vision. It was a reorganization plan. The implications of that are darker than they first appear. But to understand why Lugard proposed what he proposed, you need to understand what the British had actually built in West Africa, and what a financial disaster it was becoming. Because the two territories they were about to merge were not just different culturally. They were running completely different economies, completely different administrative models, and completely different budgets. And only one of them was making money. The official British justification for the 1914 amalgamation was, depending on which document you read, some versions offer the following: that merging the Northern and Southern Protectorates under a single administration would bring greater efficiency, more coherent governance, and the word they loved, civilization, to the peoples of the Niger territories. It was described as administrative rationalization, a logical step in the development of a stable, well-governed colonial territory. That is what went in the official record. That is what got reported in the London press. That is, broadly, what generations of schoolchildren on both sides of the colonial relationship were taught. It was not wrong exactly, but it was, to use the politest possible word, incomplete. Here is the detail that changes the shape of everything. The Southern Protectorate was profitable. The Northern Protectorate was not. The South had direct access to the coast, an established export economy built on palm oil, palm kernels, cocoa, and rubber, and a tax base that was generating revenue for the British administration. The North, by contrast, was landlocked, expensive to administer, and had been running at a deficit for years that London was covering through imperial grants, money flowing out of the British Treasury to keep the Northern Protectorate operational. Frederick Lugard himself made this explicit in his correspondence with the Colonial Office. In documents now held in the British National Archives, Lugard laid out the financial rationale for amalgamation with remarkable plainness. Combining the two territories would allow the revenue generated in the South to subsidize the administrative costs of the North. In other words, the amalgamation was, at its financial core, a mechanism for making the Northern Protectorate pay for itself using Southern money. This is documented. It is in the archive. It is not a revisionist interpretation. The historian Tekena Tamuno, writing in the 1960s, was among the first Nigerian scholars to analyze this financial logic in detail. He was not the last. The historian Toyin Falola has returned to this point repeatedly in his work, noting that the economic imbalance embedded in the amalgamation was not an accident or an oversight. It was the stated purpose. So how did it actually work? Let's follow the logic. By 1912, the Colonial Office in London had grown impatient with the cost of maintaining two separate administrations in West Africa. The North was consuming resources it was not generating. The South was generating resources that were, in the British administration's view, underutilized. The solution was, from a purely colonial accounting perspective, obvious. Merge the two territories, create a single administrative structure, use Southern customs revenue and export duties to fund Northern governance, and reduce the overall cost to the imperial treasury. Lugard was brought in as the man to execute this. He had already pioneered a system of governance in northern Nigeria called Indirect rule, a model in which the British maintained colonial control by governing through existing local power structures, specifically the emirs of the Sokoto Caliphate's successor states. He argued correctly, as far as the British were concerned, that this system could be extended southward. Instead of the British building an expensive direct administrative apparatus in the South, they would identify or create local chiefs through whom they could govern, reducing their own administrative costs while maintaining control. The problem, and it is a problem that echoes across the entire colonial period and into independence, is that indirect rule assumed something about southern Nigerian societies that was not uniformly true, that they were organized around single, identifiable, hierarchical chiefs whose authority was real and whose cooperation could be secured. In Yorubaland, where Obas existed, this worked after a fashion. In Igboland, where authority was diffused across community structures rather than concentrated in a single figure, the British simply appointed warrant chiefs, individuals granted colonial authority regardless of their standing in their own communities. The social disruption this caused was severe. The Women's War of 1929, in which tens of thousands of Igbo and Ibibio women rose up against colonial taxation and the warrant chief system, was a direct consequence of the administrative logic that the amalgamation made standard. Here is the scale of what was being administered. At the time of the amalgamation in 1914, the combined population of the Northern and Southern Protectorates was estimated at between 15 and 17 million people. They spoke, and this is a number worth sitting with, somewhere between 250 and 500 distinct languages, depending on how you classify dialects. They practiced Islam, Christianity in multiple denominations, and hundreds of distinct indigenous religious traditions. They had been governed for generations by political systems ranging from the centralized imperial structure of the Sokoto Caliphate to the decentralized republican assemblies of Igbo communities to the constitutional monarchy traditions of the Benin Kingdom to the commercial city-state governance of the Niger Delta. All of this complexity, all of this accumulated human political development was now being placed under a single administrative authority headed by one British Governor-General, Frederick Lugard. To put that in perspective, the United Kingdom itself, in 1914, had a population of roughly 45 million people. Britain spent decades and enormous resources building administrative, legal, and military infrastructure to govern itself. Nigeria's new administration had a fraction of those resources, a far larger cultural and geographic challenge, and not a single Nigerian in any senior decision-making role. The last survivor of the amalgamation era, people who were adults in 1914 and lived to speak about it, were dying in Nigerian nursing homes in the 1990s. This is not ancient history. It is living memory. That is the machinery, the economics, the administrative logic. But machinery is operated by people. And the people who lived inside this merger did not experience it as a budget decision. They experienced it as the violent reorganization of every system they had ever known. And some of them fought back in ways that the official record tried very hard to forget. Imagine Kano in the year 1900. The ancient city is enclosed by walls, mud brick fortifications that stretch for 15 kilometers around a city of roughly 100,000 people. Inside those walls, the dye pits are already running, producing the indigo-dyed cloth that has been exported across the Sahara for centuries. The Central Market is one of the most active commercial spaces in West Africa. Leather goods from Kano are sold in North Africa and Europe. The Emirates Court maintains a detailed administrative record system. The roads connecting to other northern cities are better maintained than most roads in rural England at the same time. Now imagine Lagos in 1890. The harbor is full. British, Brazilian, and Sierra Leonean merchants are negotiating prices for palm oil. The Sero-freed slaves who have returned from Sierra Leone with Western education, Christian faith, and commercial ambition have built a community that is producing lawyers, doctors, journalists, and businessmen. The newspaper Iwe Irohin, launched in 1859 by missionary Henry Townsend, but shaped significantly by Yoruba Christian elites, has been running for 3 decades. There are educated Lagosians who have traveled to London, who read British newspapers, who argue cases in British courts, and who write letters to the Colonial Office criticizing British policy in English with impeccable legal precision. There is one figure from this period who deserves far more space in the popular history of Nigeria's creation than he is typically given. Herbert Macaulay. grandson of Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, the first African Anglican bishop. Macaulay was a Lagos-based civil engineer, journalist, and political agitator who spent most of the early 20th century making himself an absolute nuisance to the British colonial administration in the most productive possible way. By 1914, he was already in open opposition to colonial land policy in Lagos. He understood, with precision, what the amalgamation meant for southern Nigerian political elites who had spent decades developing a relationship, contentious but real, with the British administration. That relationship was now being restructured, with power moving further away from Nigerians and more firmly into British hands. Macaulay would go on to found the Nigerian National Democratic Party in 1923, the first political party in Nigerian history, and to co-found the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons with Nnamdi Azikiwe in 1944. But in 1914, his opposition was already present, already documented, and already being monitored by the colonial administration. He was not alone. The Lagos press, which had been one of the most active in West Africa since the 1880s, was vocal about the implications of the merger for southern Nigerian political development. Newspapers like the Lagos Weekly Record ran analyses of what amalgamation would mean for the governance of the South. These analyses were sophisticated, legally informed, and pointed. They also had no impact whatsoever on the outcome. The voices were not silenced in the sense of being forcibly shut down. They were simply ignored, which, for the purposes of political outcomes, amounts to the same thing. Here is the thing the British administrative record does not adequately explain: how much organizational capacity ordinary Nigerians brought to resisting the consequences of the amalgamation era, despite having no role in creating it. The Women's War of 1929, Ogu Umunwanyi in Igbo, Ekong Iban in Ibibio, is the most dramatic example. Tens of thousands of women across southeastern Nigeria, with no centralized organizational structure, no political party, and no external support, coordinated one of the largest anti-colonial uprisings in West African history. They were responding specifically to the administrative consequences of the indirect rule system that the amalgamation had extended southward, the warrant chiefs, the threat of taxation on women and their livestock, and the general humiliation of watching their community governance structures being overridden by British-appointed functionaries. The British response was to shoot them. 32 women were killed, 31 wounded. The official inquiry that followed, the Aba Commission of Inquiry, ultimately acknowledged that the warrant chief system was a failure. It did not bring back the dead. But here is what the colonial record did not expect and could not fully explain. The women won. Not immediately, not without cost. But the warrant chief system was reformed. The administrative arrogance that produced it was, at least partially, checked. The women of southeastern Nigeria, organizing in 1929 with no political infrastructure that the British recognized as legitimate, achieved something that years of petitions and newspaper editorials from educated Lagos elites had not. They changed British colonial policy through the direct and unignorable expression of collective will. But none of what happened inside Nigeria happened in a vacuum. The world outside was watching, or more precisely, the world outside had already decided what Nigeria was and what it was for. And the story of how that external perception was constructed and how Nigerians began to push back against it is a story that runs from 1914 all the way to the arguments happening in international courts and museum boardrooms today. In 1914, the London press covered the Nigerian amalgamation with approximately the enthusiasm you would give a mid-level administrative restructuring, which is to say, briefly and without drama. The Times of London noted it. The Colonial Office issued its formal communiques. In the broader context of January 1914, 4 months before Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination would set Europe on its path to catastrophe. The reorganization of a West African colonial territory was not front-page news. What the British press did not cover, and what the Colonial Office reports carefully avoided, was any substantive account of what the peoples being merged thought about the arrangement. The operating assumption of mainstream British commentary on colonial Africa in this period was what the historian Anna Haywood describes as administrative determinism, the belief that colonial subjects did not have political opinions worth recording, only administrative needs worth managing. The Nigerian press, by sharp contrast, was fully engaged. Editors at the Lagos Weekly Record, the Lagos Standard, and other publications were writing about the amalgamation with genuine analytical depth, examining the legal implications, questioning the financial logic, and, in some cases, arguing that the merger represented a step backward for the political development of southern Nigerian communities that had spent decades building formal relationships with the colonial government. These arguments were not covered by the London press. They were not summarized in Colonial Office briefings sent back to London. They existed in full, in print, accessible to anyone who chose to look, and for the most part, no one in any official British capacity chose to look. The moment when the wider world began to genuinely grapple with what the amalgamation had created did not come in 1914. It came at independence in 1960. And more specifically, in the years immediately after. By the mid-1960s, the tensions that the British had embedded in the structure of Nigeria, the North-South revenue imbalance, the unresolved question of who held political authority at the federal level, the ethnic and regional competition that the colonial administrative structure had both reflected and intensified, had escalated into a political crisis. The military coups of January and July 1966 brought those tensions into the open. The Biafra War of 1967 to 1970 was, in one of its fundamental dimensions, a war about the amalgamation, about whether the structure created in 1914 was one that could hold. It was at this point that international journalists, scholars, and political observers began asking seriously, what exactly had the British created in 1914, and on what basis had they assumed it was viable? The answers that came back were, for the most part, uncomfortable. Here is a thing that is easy to miss in the grief and outrage of this history. The amalgamation also accelerated something extraordinary, forcing people from hundreds of different national and linguistic backgrounds into a single administrative territory created, over time, conditions for a new kind of identity, one that was not simply Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa or Ijo, but Nigerian. That identity was contested, fragile, and sometimes weaponized. It was also real. The writers, musicians, scholars, and political thinkers who emerged from this shared colonial space,
Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Fela Kuti, Aminu Kano,
and dozens of others created work that addressed the contradictions of this inherited national project with a depth and intensity that would not have existed without the collision. The fact that it remains relevant tells you something about how slowly the structural problems of 1914 have moved. What was lost in 1914 was not primarily territory. What was lost was political self-determination, the right of the hundreds of nations within that territory to continue developing their own governance systems, their own economic relationships, and their own futures at their own pace and on their own terms. Some of those governance systems were unjust. Some were already in crisis. Some were violent. This history does not require you to romanticize what existed before 1914. It requires you to be honest about the fact that the people living in those systems had the capacity to reform, contest, and develop them, and that the amalgamation, by subordinating all of that to a single colonial administrative structure, removed that capacity. What remains is a country of over 220 million people, the most populous nation in Africa, the largest black nation on earth that is still, over a century later, working through the question of whether the entity created in 1914 is the entity it wants to be. That is not a small thing. That is the central question of Nigerian political life. And it has its roots, directly and traceably, in the morning of January 1, 1914. Given all of that, the financial logic, the ignored voices, the structural tensions, the century of unresolved questions here is the thing that most people, even people who know this history reasonably well, do not know. The single fact about the 1914 amalgamation that, once you know it, makes everything that came after feel less like an accident and more like a consequence. The conventional understanding of the 1914 amalgamation goes roughly like this. The British, for reasons of administrative efficiency and colonial ambition, merged their two West African protectorates into a single territory. It was imperfect, it was imposed, but it was in some broad sense an attempt to create a viable colonial unit that might eventually become a viable independent state. That version of events is not exactly wrong, but here is what it leaves out. Frederick Lugard, the man who carried out the amalgamation, who wrote the reports that justified it, who was celebrated in Britain as the architect of modern Nigeria was, by the time he proposed the merger, operating under a very specific set of personal pressures that have almost never been discussed in the popular history of this period. Lugard wanted to marry Flora Shaw. Flora Shaw was the woman who had named Nigeria. She was a celebrated journalist, the colonial editor of the Times of London, one of the most influential voices on British imperial policy of her generation. She was also, by the standards of her time, too old for conventional marriage. She was in her early 50s when she and Lugard finally married in 1912. But here is the point. Lugard's career ambitions and his relationship with Shaw were intertwined with his determination to secure a prestigious, permanent posting, the kind of senior administrative role that would give him the status and the salary to sustain the life he wanted. His pursuit of the governor-generalship of a unified Nigeria was in part a career maneuver. His proposal to amalgamate the two territories was the thing that made that position possible. There would be no governor-general of a unified Nigeria without a unified Nigeria to govern. This does not mean the amalgamation happened because of a love story. That would be absurd, and this channel does not trade in absurdity. What it means is this. The decision to amalgamate one of the most complex human territories on Earth to join the fates of 15 million people across hundreds of distinct nations was made through a process in which personal ambition, imperial accounting, and bureaucratic convenience were the primary drivers. Not study of the peoples involved, not consultation, not even serious debate within the colonial office about whether the structure being proposed was viable in the long run. The historian Marjorie Perham, who wrote the authoritative two-volume biography of Lugard, published in 1956 and 1960, was as sympathetic to Lugard as any serious biographer could be, and even she documented the degree to which his proposal for amalgamation was driven by his determination to secure the top job. The financial rationale was real. The administrative logic had genuine content. But the process, the speed, the lack of consultation, the imposition reflected the priorities of a man and a system that were not fundamentally concerned with whether what they were building would work for the people inside it. Here is the implication that matters. Every major structural tension in Nigerian political life, the North-South divide, the question of revenue sharing, the debate about federalism versus centralization, the persistent crisis of national identity, the ethnic competition for political power at the federal level has its roots in the specific structure of the 1914 merger. Not as a general colonial legacy, but as the specific consequence of design choices made in the absence of any genuine engagement with the people being designed for. Lugard's 1920 book, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, became one of the most influential texts on colonial governance ever written. It was read in universities and cited in colonial office policy debates for decades. In it, Lugard argued that colonial rule served a dual mandate. It developed the colonized territory while returning profit to the colonizing power. The book was widely praised. What it did not contain in any chapter, in any footnote, in any sentence, was a serious engagement with whether the people of Nigeria, specifically, had endorsed the arrangement he was describing. They had not been asked. And that absence, that foundational structural absence of Nigerian consent from the process that created Nigeria, is the wound that has never fully closed. It is not metaphorical. It is architectural. It is built into the Constitution, the revenue formula, the state boundaries, the power-sharing arrangements, and the unresolved arguments about what Nigeria is and who it belongs to. Knowing that does not solve anything, but it does clarify something essential. Nigeria's structural challenges are not mysteries. They are not the result of some inherent failure of the Nigerian people. They are the predictable, documented, traceable consequences of a structure that was built without the people it was built around. That is the thing that changes everything. What happened on January 1, 1914, in Lugard Hall, Lokoja, was not a minor administrative event. It was the moment at which the futures of more than 15 million people were formalized into a structure that none of them had designed, none of them had voted for, and most of them would spend the next century trying to live inside or trying to change. Nigeria is not a failed state. That framing is lazy and it is wrong. Nigeria is a state that has been doing something extraordinarily difficult since the first day of its existence, trying to build genuine national cohesion across a complexity of peoples, languages, religions, and political traditions that would challenge any system of governance in the world. The fact that this has been hard is not evidence of Nigerian failure. It is evidence of the scale of the problem that was created in 1914 and the stubborn, extraordinary, sometimes maddening determination of Nigerian people to wrestle with that problem. Understanding where the problem actually came from, not the convenient myth of tribal incompatibility, not the patronizing narrative of post-colonial dysfunction, but the specific, documented, financially motivated administrative decision made by a British civil servant who wanted a better job title, is not just interesting history. It is the first honest step towards something better. After months with this material, what I keep coming back to is not outrage, though the outrage is justified. What I keep coming back to is this. The people who were inside this history were not passive. They argued, they organized, they wrote, they marched, they fought. They created extraordinary things in impossible conditions. The Nigeria that exists today with all its contradictions and all its power is, more than anything else, their achievement, not Lugard's. Not the colonial offices, theirs. That feels important to say plainly. If you made it this far, and I mean genuinely, if you are still here, then you already know this channel is not going to give you the comfortable version of anything. Hit subscribe, because the algorithm needs to know you are the kind of person who watches history at this depth. And because the next video goes somewhere I promise you did not expect, we are going deep on the Lagos colony annexation of 1861, the deal that started all of this, and the Oba who saw it coming 50 years before anyone else did. And I want to know something in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. When you learn that a country's structural problems have a specific, traceable origin, not a vague colonial legacy, but an actual decision made by actual people, for documented reasons, does that make you more hopeful or less hopeful about the possibility of change? For me, after all of this research, the answer surprised me. I'll tell you why in the next one.